one would become an alcoholic. Anyone who stops working, it was tricky, and there were tricky times. I was having a tricky year, and it was quite stressy.
Jeremy Clarkson just got the news every man dreads, on camera. In the new season of Clarkson's Farm, the man who spent years loudly telling other blokes to get themselves checked suddenly had to face his own advice.
The problems were getting bigger and bigger. The lack of support was appalling. Home life was difficult. They were very stressy times. So this is a terrible culture, and it's all of management in Britain suffers from it.
This isn't another story about wheat, weather, or tractors. At 66, the loud, confident Jeremy Clarkson discovered something that left everyone in that room stunned. And it might just hit you harder than you expect. The heart scare that kicked off the season. Season 5 of Clarkson's Farm opens with Jeremy in a hospital bed, and the story behind that scene goes back 2 years to a holiday in the Indian Ocean in 2024. He came home from that trip already feeling off in ways he could not explain away. His chest felt tight. His left arm tingled with pins and needles, the sort of sensation that usually means trouble. A few days earlier, while he was still abroad, he had to pause and check his own legs were working before he stood up out of a chair. Swimming, which was something he had done his whole life without a second thought, suddenly felt like a fight. Even walking down a flight of stairs without grabbing onto someone became hard work. Within hours of getting home, he was sitting in a hospital being told this looked a lot like a heart attack. It turned out to be something slightly different, but serious enough that doctors fitted him with 2 stents, the small tubes used to push open a blocked artery so blood can move through properly again. Jeremy wrote about the whole thing afterward in his newspaper column, joking that a couple of hours later, he was sitting there thinking about how close that really was. His doctors did not mess around with the advice either. They told him to slow down, to stop pushing himself at the pace he always had, and one of them floated the idea of swapping out his stressful schedule for something gentler, like golf. This was not even the first warning his body had thrown at him. Years before, he had given up cigarettes after catching pneumonia on holiday in Spain. The kind of scare that finally pushed him to drop a habit he had held on to for decades. So the heart trouble in 2024 fit a pattern that had been building for a while, his body telling him in its own blunt way that he could not keep running at full throttle forever. That hospital bed became the very first image of Season 5, and it set a tone the show had never really used before. Clarkson's Farm had already become one of the biggest hits in Amazon's history in the UK at that point, with its second series pulling in nearly 4.3 million television viewers and becoming the platform's most watched original show in the country. Farmers themselves had embraced it too. A sheep farmer, James Rebanks, said publicly that Jeremy had done more good for farming in a single series than 30 years of the BBC's long-running farming program Countryfile had managed. That kind of goodwill meant a lot, because it meant millions of people were emotionally invested in this farm and the man running it long before anyone knew what else was coming. The farm itself was already in the middle of a brutal stretch too, dealing with a bovine tuberculosis outbreak that forced the whole place into lockdown for roughly 7 months under UK law, with barns meant for grain storage turned into makeshift shelters for sick animals instead. So before anyone watching had any clue what Jeremy was personally about to go through, the season had already built up a heavy weight sitting underneath all the usual jokes and chaos, and that weight was only going to get heavier from there. The making of an untouchable man. Jeremy did not arrive at fame by accident, and it took him years of grinding through motoring journalism before anyone outside the trade knew his name. He had a knack for writing about cars that made them feel like more than machines, turning a basic road test into something that read like a personal story. That talent carried him onto Top Gear, and when the show relaunched in 2002, it grew far beyond what anyone working on it expected. At its peak, the program reached audiences in 170 countries, and a big part of that pull came down to the chemistry between Jeremy, Richard Hammond, and James May, 3 men who genuinely seemed to enjoy winding each other up on camera. Fame like that rarely comes without trouble trailing right behind it. Jeremy built a reputation for saying things that landed badly almost as often as the things that landed brilliantly. And in 2015, that reputation finally cost him something big. After a long day of filming, he was told the production crew could not get him a hot steak, and the argument that followed turned physical, leaving producer Oisin Timon with a bloody lip. The BBC suspended him within days and then let him go for good, despite the head of the broadcaster publicly admitting he had always been a fan of Jeremy's work. Jeremy ended up settling with Timon for a sum reported at around £100,000 and issued a public apology through his lawyer, making clear that none of what happened was Timon's fault. He barely paused after any of it, though. He, Hammond, and May signed with Amazon soon after and built the Grand Tour from the ground up, a show that became one of the platform's biggest hits before the three of them wound it down in September 2024 and moved on to other projects without much fanfare. Then, in 2019, he did something nobody who thought they had him figured out saw coming. He decided to become a farmer. You see, Jeremy had actually owned the land long before any of this. He bought 436 acres in Oxfordshire back in 2008, but for years he left the actual farming to a local man who rented the fields and grew crops on them as a tenant. That arrangement only ended in 2019, when the tenant retired, and Jeremy made the surprising choice to start running the farm himself, instead of finding someone else to take over or simply selling the land. He openly admitted he had no real idea how to manage a working farm, which made the decision even more surprising to people who only knew him as a man obsessed with speed and engines. When the farm became personal, running diddly squat turned out to be far harder than Jeremy bargained for. And that struggle is exactly what made Clarkson's farm such a massive hit when it premiered in 2021. People who had spent years watching him argue about cars now watched him argue about soil and planning permission instead. And somehow, it was even better than the show before it. A lot of that came down to Caleb Cooper, the young farmer Jeremy hired who knew everything about the land that Jeremy did not. Watching the loudest man on British television get repeatedly outsmarted by someone half his age who actually understood the work gave the show a level of warmth that was truly surprising to many. Somewhere in the middle of all that mud and chaos, farming stopped being a television gimmick for Jeremy and turned into something he actually cared about, away from the cameras too. Part of that came down to the people who built that world alongside him. His partner, Lisa Hogan, a former actress originally from Dublin, gave up her own work as a sculptor to run the farm shop and turned it into something close to her own creative project, handling everything from the shelves to the branding, while Jeremy handled the chaos out in the fields. He became one of the most visible defenders of British farmers in the public eye, too. And in November 2024, he showed up to a protest in London against a new inheritance tax on agricultural land that had farmers across the country furious. And he wasn't there as some celebrity who was only trying to boost his image, but as someone who knew what those farmers were going through because he too was a part of that community. That was kind of a big deal because it meant people had started trusting him on things that were real-life issues, not just things that made good television. The proof of how far that goodwill stretched showed up in an unlikely place too. The farm shop he and Lisa opened became so popular after the show aired that it once caused a 3-mile traffic jam on the country roads nearby, forcing police to step in just to keep cars moving through the area. So when he eventually had something far more serious to tell that same audience, the trust was already there, built up over years of watching him struggle through smaller fights on that same patch of land. What none of his viewers knew yet was that this particular fight had already played out once before. Right there on the farm, in someone Jeremy worked alongside almost every single day. Gerald already fought this battle. One of the most beloved figures to come out of Clarkson's farm is Gerald Cooper, an older farmer whose West Country accent is so thick that producers reportedly considered subtitles just so viewers could keep up. Gerald is often credited on the show as the farm's stone wall specialist, the person who handles the old-fashioned dry stone walling that holds parts of the property together. And he carries himself with such an unbothered energy that calms down whatever chaos is happening around him. In an earlier season, Gerald revealed he had been diagnosed with prostate cancer, and the cameras followed him through the whole thing the same plain way they covered everything else on the farm without piling extra drama on top of it. He simply kept working through it, the same way he handles every hard day out on the land. In June 2024, Gerald shared the news that he was officially cancer-free, and it became one of the show's most genuinely happy moments for longtime fans. People who had grown attached to him over multiple seasons let out a breath. A lot of them did not even realize they were holding. For Jeremy, watching someone he worked beside almost daily go through a cancer diagnosis and come out fine on the other end gave him something close to a preview, a living example of what beating this disease could actually look like up close. Gerald was not the only steady face holding that farm together either. Charlie Ireland, the land agent who helped Jeremy make sense of the business side of running Diddley Squat, had become just as central to the show by this point. He was the calm and practical voice standing between Jeremy's big ideas and Caleb's hands-on knowledge of the land. Between the three of them, plus Gerald working away in the background, the farm had grown into something that felt less like a workplace and more like a strange, tightly bonded little family that had already weathered one crisis after another together. None of them had any idea at the time, but Gerald's recovery was not going to stay just a nice moment from an earlier season. Gerald continued showing up throughout Season 5 too, remaining one of the steady, comforting presences on the farm even as everything else around him grew somewhat harder. Only a couple of years after his own recovery, standing in a field talking through harvest plans for the very same farm they had built side by side, Jeremy would be the one carrying a diagnosis nobody saw coming. Looking back at it now, the timing feels almost too strange to be a coincidence. The secret he carried through May. The trouble started in a way these things usually do, without any big dramatic sign attached to it. At some point during filming for the new season, Jeremy noticed something was off with his body, and instead of dealing with it in front of the cameras right away, he stepped away from the show for a stretch, without telling most people what was actually going on. He went and had a biopsy done, which is a procedure where doctors take a small sample of tissue to study under a microscope, and is a process that usually takes only minutes, but can leave a person waiting days or even weeks for the lab results to come back. He had to sit through that waiting alone for the most part, going about his normal routine on the surface, while not knowing yet whether his whole life was about to take a different turn. When the results came, they confirmed it was cancer, and the word doctors used to describe it was aggressive, meaning it was the kind that tends to grow and spread faster than most other types of the disease. Buried inside all of that bad news was one piece of good fortune. Fortunately, doctors had caught it early, before it had any real chance to spread further through his body. And that single detail was going to end up mattering more than almost anything else in this whole story. And Jeremy, being Jeremy, he kept filming his show. He kept running the farm the same way he always had, without slowing down or letting anyone outside a small circle know what he was going through. He held on to this secret through weeks of ongoing work, hoping he could push through the harvest first and only deal with treatment once the busiest stretch of the farming calendar was finally behind him. He had even sketched out a rough date for the operation, hoping to get it done quickly and get straight back to the fields, describing the surgery itself as something that would be in and out fast, even if the recovery afterward would take a fair bit longer. But that was just hopeful thinking for Jeremy because he couldn't manage to keep such a big secret the way he thought he could. The conversation in the field. The moment Jeremy dropped his huge secret on his partners, and obviously his viewers, happened in the middle of episode 7, and not even in the season's final episode, which somehow makes it hit even harder for anyone watching from the start. The scene plays out like any other working day on the farm. Jeremy sits down with Caleb Cooper and Charlie Ireland to talk through plans for finishing the harvest before the weather turns against them, with Lisa and a couple of the other farm workers nearby as well. Nothing about the setup hints at what is about to happen. Then, with his eyes visibly welling up, Jeremy says it. "I've got cancer." Caleb's reaction is instant and completely unscripted, the kind of response no amount of editing could ever fake. "No, you haven't," he says, then asks where. Jeremy tries to wave the question off first, saying where it is of no concern to anybody. Within seconds, though, he drops the deflection entirely and explains the whole thing anyway, almost like he cannot help himself once he starts. "I've known since May," he tells them both. "I disappeared off the other week and I had a biopsy, and it is cancer, and it's aggressive, but it's really early." He tries to settle them down right after, promising he will be fine, though he warns them he will be out of action for a little while. He had genuinely been hoping to finish the entire harvest before treatment started, but his body was not interested in cooperating with the farming calendar. The timing, in his own words, was going to fall slap bang in the middle of everything, and there was nothing anyone standing in that field could do to change it. The operation and the mistake that followed. Doctors moved ahead with surgery to remove the part of the prostate where the cancer was sitting, using a focused ultrasound approach aimed directly at the affected tissue rather than taking out the whole gland. Speaking from a hospital bed afterward, Jeremy described the result in his usual blunt style, saying that 10% of his prostate was now dead, the exact 10% where the cancer had been. Coming from anyone else, that line might sound almost clinical, but the Jeremy that we've all known for decades has never been one to beat around the bush or sugarcoat facts. He says it as it is. He admitted in an interview later just how serious things could have turned if the timing had gone differently. "It was an aggressive type of cancer," he said. "It could have spread. It could have gone into the pancreas. It could have gone anywhere. And that would have been real trouble." But that was not the end of Jeremy's ordeal. A couple of weeks after the cancer surgery, he made a call on his own that nearly landed him right back in the hospital for an entirely different reason. He had been taking blood-thinning medication for his earlier heart trouble, the same stents and vascular issues from 2 years before, and during cancer treatment, he had to come off those substances completely, since blood thinners can make surgery and recovery far riskier than they would otherwise be. Once he started feeling a bit better, he decided on his own, without checking with anyone first, to go back on them, assuming his body had healed enough to handle it. He admitted later that this was a serious mistake and entirely his own fault. The decision triggered what he called a very big emergency in the middle of the night, sending him straight back into a hospital bed dealing with something he described afterward as horrific. He owned the mistake openly when reporters asked about it, saying flatly that it was all on him. 2 hospital beds in 1 season. When the final episode of Season 5 aired, Jeremy was once again lying in a hospital bed, and he pointed out himself just how strange that felt. "We started Season 5 with me in a hospital bed," he said, "and here we are at the end of Season 5, and I'm back in a hospital bed." It was such a cliché coincidence that anyone would feel it was scripted, except all these events were never planned. Life simply handed him the same image twice in 1 year for 2 entirely different reasons that had nothing to do with each other. Jeremy let the cameras keep rolling through both of these moments, and honestly, not everyone could have done that. It kind of speaks loudly about the type of person he is. He could have asked for the cameras off, could have kept this private, and announced it later through a carefully worded statement instead. His audience watched the real thing unfold instead, shock and all, with no editing smoothing it over for them. The final scene of the season shows an ambulance pulling up at Diddley Squat, and the episode cuts straight from there to Jeremy in that hospital bed, explaining that part of his treatment had gone wrong. He told Caleb and Charlie directly on camera that if everything went well, he would see them for Season 6, and if it did not, he would not be there at all. The same finale carried one more hard moment that had nothing to do with his health. Earlier in those episodes, the farm's first ever cow, pregnant with twins, had to be sent away to be slaughtered after 2 inconclusive tuberculosis tests came back unclear. A post-mortem later showed she never actually had the disease at all, news that left Jeremy furious once he found out, though by then nothing could undo the loss. On top of that, the season also tracked a new UK government budget that hit agricultural land hard, slashing environmental subsidies right as Jeremy and Charlie had poured money into new equipment meant to modernize how the farm operated. Stacked on top of his own diagnosis, the final 2 episodes barely gave viewers a chance to breathe between one heavy moment and the next. The fact that everything played out, unscripted and honest, made the entire thing even more emotional for everyone watching at home. Watching him find out how serious things might actually get, sitting right there with him through the uncertainty as it happened in real time, hit differently than reading about it secondhand ever could. That same uncertainty would pull him into conversations with other well-known men who understood exactly what he was going through, because they had already lived through versions of it themselves. The strangest lunch club in Britain. In the weeks after going public, Jeremy ended up in a situation that sounds almost too unusual to be real, except it genuinely happened just this way. He started meeting up regularly with former Prime Minister David Cameron and the food writer Giles Coren, both of whom had gone through their own prostate cancer diagnoses in recent years. The 3 of them, plus a couple of other men in similar situations, started having lunch together every so often, swapping notes on their illness with the same ease other people might use talking about a football match from the weekend. Jeremy described these lunches in a way that was obviously more lighthearted than it might have happened. He admitted that everyone in the group has different Gleason scores, which is the rating doctors use to measure how aggressive a case of prostate cancer actually is, along with different Stockholm and PSA scores too, which are the other numbers used to track how the disease is responding to treatment. He joked that he gets completely muddled trying to remember his own numbers among everyone else's, comparing the whole exchange to old friends swapping stories about past injuries rather than anything resembling a support group. David Cameron told him people regularly come up to him in public bathrooms of all places just to say that hearing about his diagnosis is the reason they finally went and got themselves tested. Because the fact is, a famous person admitting they have prostate cancer carries more weight than a passing headline ever could. For ordinary men reading about it at home, it becomes a nudge, sometimes the only one they ever get, to finally book the appointment they had been putting off for years without telling anyone why. The idea of well-known men gathering specifically to talk through their cancer experience together also struck a chord with people who heard about it, since it chipped away steadily at the old assumption that men are supposed to deal with serious health scares alone and in silence. And behind all the joking, there is still the fact that Jeremy is a father to 3 grown children, Emily, Finlo, and Katya, and a grandfather to 2 young grandchildren, Arlo and Xanthi. He could joke all he wanted about those Gleason scores at that lunch table, but the fact is, surviving for his own sake mattered less to him than staying around long enough to watch those grandchildren grow up. Remission and the reason he's still here. Months after the surgery, the answer Jeremy had been waiting for finally arrived. A PSA test came back showing no sign of the disease anywhere, and he confirmed publicly that he is officially in remission. He shared the update in a video on his Instagram page, opening with a line only he could really pull off. "The more observant among you will have noticed, I'm not dead," he said. "I'm not just not dead. I'm perfectly fine." He explained exactly why he is fine, giving full credit to the one decision that started this entire chain of events months earlier. He shared that the reason he is fine is because doctors caught the prostate cancer early, and they caught it early because he got tested. He pushed back against the excuse so many men give for skipping the test altogether, joking that people worry it means someone has to put a finger inside them, when really, it is just a simple blood test these days. He reminded everyone watching that somewhere between 10 and 12,000 men across the United Kingdom die from this disease every single year. And he urged people plainly, more than once, not to become one of them. He repeated the message again days later in a separate interview, almost as if one mention would not be enough to make it stick with the people who needed to hear it most. Speaking with reporters afterward, Jeremy admitted the news landed harder emotionally than he had expected going in, saying people from as far away as Australia were already texting him the moment it aired overseas. He spoke about how distressing it must be for anyone living with the knowledge that an illness might eventually take their life, bringing up the former Olympic cyclist Chris Hoy, who had separately revealed his own cancer was inoperable, saying he could not get his head around the courage it takes to carry on after hearing news like that. He called himself the world's luckiest man, and meant it. Life kept moving regardless. Around the same period, he was reportedly already back filming new episodes of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, the British quiz show he hosts, which is a sign that the man who once feared he might not make it to season 6 was already looking past the diagnosis entirely. The man who spent years warning everyone else about this exact disease ended up needing his own advice more than anyone watching him ever did. And the only reason he's still here to keep giving that advice is because he actually followed it himself first. So, tell us your thoughts on Jeremy's story. Do you think he is actually the luckiest man alive, like he said? And when was the last time you got yourself checked? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.